On the night of February 1st, 1959, 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their own tent from the inside and ran into a Siberian blizzard in the dark. Some of them were barefoot, most were half-dressed, and they ran straight into a cold that can kill a person in minutes. Every one of them died. Here's the thing that's stuck with people for over 60 years now. These weren't tourists who wandered in over their heads. They were young, they were fit, and they were trained for exactly this kind of country. So whatever came out of the dark that night, it scared them so badly that staying in a warm tent felt more dangerous than running, with no shoes, into 30 below zero. What could possibly do that? People have been arguing about it ever since, and the answers have run all the way from an avalanche to a secret weapon to something that doesn't even have a name. So let's actually walk through it. What happened, and which of the modern explanations really holds up? They came from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, what's now Yekaterinburg. 10 of them, most in their early 20s, nearly all seasoned cross-country skiers and mountaineers. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student, and by every account, a careful, respected guy who knew how to run an expedition. The plan was to reach a mountain called Oterten in the far north of the Urals in the dead of winter, pull it off, and they'd earn the Soviet Union's highest hiking certification. Again, these people knew what they were doing. But early on, one of them, Yuri Yudin, got sick. Bad joint pain, enough that he had to turn back. He said goodbye to his friends and went home. And that illness saved his life. Yudin would be the only one of the group to grow old. He carried the mystery of what happened to his friends for the rest of his days, and he died in 2013. The other 9 kept going north, and we actually know their route in unusual detail because they kept diaries and shot rolls of film that were developed later. The last photos show them laughing, digging into the snow, setting up camp. Ordinary young people, tired and happy, with no idea they had only hours left. On February 1st, they climbed up onto the eastern shoulder of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl. Usually that gets translated as Dead Mountain. It probably just means nothing much grows up there, but it's a hard name to shake once you know what's coming. And this is where Dyatlov made the decision that investigators would chew on for decades. Instead of dropping down into the tree line about a mile away, where the forest would have shielded them from the wind, they pitched their tent right out on the open, exposed slope. Maybe Dyatlov didn't want to give up the elevation he'd fought for. Whatever the reason, they cut a flat platform into the snow, set up one big tent, and settled in for the night. That's the last thing any of them did that we can fully account for. When the group didn't come back on schedule, and the telegram they were supposed to send never arrived, worry set in, slowly at first, then all at once. The families pushed the institute to send help. A search got underway, and on February 26th, they found the tent. It was still standing, just barely, partly collapsed, buried under snow. And it had been cut open from the inside, slashed. Somebody had taken a knife to the canvas wall and torn their way out, rather than just use the door. Inside, almost everything was still there. Their boots, their coats, their food, their axes. Everything you'd need to survive a night on that mountain, left behind. And leading away from the tent, down the slope toward the forest, were footprints, made by people in socks, or one boot, or bare feet. 8 or 9 sets of them. And here's the eerie part. They weren't running in a panicked scatter. They were walking, in a more or less orderly line, away from shelter, into the cold that was going to kill them. The searchers followed those tracks downhill. About a mile on, at the edge of the forest, there was a tall cedar tree, and under it, the first two bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko, dressed in almost nothing but their underwear. Next to them were the remains of a small fire, and the cedar's branches were snapped off as high as 5 meters up, like someone had climbed it in desperation, either to see back toward the tent or to break off wood to burn. Then, scattered between the cedar and the tent, as if they'd been trying to crawl back to camp, 3 more: Dyatlov himself, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They'd died facing uphill toward the tent they'd run from. All 5 of them died of hypothermia. And as awful as that is, it's at least a story that makes sense. They left shelter with almost no clothes on, and they froze. It was the other 4 that turned a tragedy into a legend. They weren't found until May, when the snow finally started to melt. They were down in a ravine, in a stream bed, buried under several meters of snow, about 75 meters deeper into the forest than the cedar. And their bodies did not tell a simple story about the cold. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a fractured skull. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had massive chest fractures, ribs driven inward with tremendous force. The doctor who examined them said the force involved was like a car crash. And here's the detail that's haunted everyone ever since. There were no matching wounds on the outside, no deep cuts, nothing that looked like a beating over the shattered bone. It was as if they'd been crushed by something enormous and blunt and completely impersonal. And it gets worse. Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and some of the tissue of her face. Zolotaryov was missing his eyes too. This is the point where the story usually tips over into pure horror. Mutilation. Something inhuman out there in the dark. Hang on to that thought, though, because there is an explanation, and it's grim, but it's very much of this world. We'll get there. There were 2 more strange details. Some of the 4 in the ravine were better dressed than the 5 up on the slope, because they were wearing clothing taken from the friends who died first, cut off the bodies and shared out among the living, which means some of them survived long enough to think and adapt and make cold, practical decisions. And when investigators tested the clothing, a few items came back with higher than normal radiation. The Soviet inquiry wrapped up in the spring of 1959 with a line that explained absolutely nothing while hinting at everything. The hikers, it said, had died because of a compelling natural force they couldn't overcome. Then the files were archived. The area was closed to hikers for 3 years, and officially, that was the end of it. The pass has carried Igor Dyatlov's name ever since. So sit with all of that for a second, and you can see exactly why this case refuses to die. 9 capable people cut their way out of a tent and walked, underdressed, to their deaths. Some had injuries a doctor compared to a car crash, with almost nothing on the skin to show for it. Faces and soft tissue were gone. The clothing was faintly radioactive. Other hikers and locals reported strange orange lights or glowing spheres in the sky over that region that same winter. And the Soviet state, not exactly known for its transparency, sealed the whole thing shut and looked the other way. Into a silence like that, every theory you can imagine came flooding in. A secret military weapons test, an escaped prisoner, the local Mansi people defending sacred ground, which investigators actually looked into and firmly ruled out because there were no other footprints, no trace of any outsider at all. a Yeti, which came out of a single joke photo the hikers staged themselves. Aliens, the KGB. Some experiment gone wrong, and most of those fall apart on one simple question. Where's the second set of tracks? Everything at the scene says the hikers did this themselves. They fled their own tent, on their own 2 feet, and nobody chased them down the mountain. So the real question was never, who did this to them? It was, what could scare trained mountaineers out of their shelter into a blizzard, and then break their bones without leaving a mark? The serious modern theories are all attempts to answer that exact question. The leading one today is something the original investigators actually thought about and then dismissed: a slab-avalanche. Now forget the roaring white wall you're picturing. A slab-avalanche is quieter and weirder than that. It happens when a firm, heavy plate of wind-packed snow is sitting on top of a weaker, looser layer underneath. Put enough stress on it, and the whole slab can suddenly break free and slide as a single block, even on a slope that looks way too gentle for an avalanche. And for years, that idea got laughed off. The slope wasn't steep enough. There was no obvious avalanche debris when searchers got there weeks later. If a wall of snow hit the tent, why was the tent still there at all? Then in 2021, 2 engineers, Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzrin, put out a study that answered those objections with actual physics. Their model pointed to a specific, delayed kind of slab release. When Dyatlov's group cut that flat platform into the slope to set up the tent, they undercut the snow sitting above them. Then those fierce local downslope winds, katabatic winds, kept piling fresh snow onto the weakened slab all night. And hours later, in the dark, it finally let go and slid down onto the uphill half of the tent. It didn't have to be big. A block of dense snow just a couple of meters across, coming down on people who are lying down, can cause exactly the injuries the autopsies found: crushing chest and skull fractures with very little damage to the skin because the weight is spread out and blunt. To get the mechanics right, the team even borrowed animation code that was originally built to model snow in a Disney movie. And all of a sudden, the whole night makes a terrible kind of sense. The slab comes down. People are hurt. It's pitch dark. They're panicking. And they're sure a bigger slide is coming. So they cut their way out and head downhill to the trees, which is genuinely the right instinct in an avalanche. They get a fire going at the cedar. They try to take care of the injured. And then the cold just does what the cold does. The ones who could still move died trying to get back up to the tent for supplies. The badly hurt ones died down in the ravine, in the stream, where they dug in. The study didn't call itself proof, to be clear. It said a slab avalanche was plausible, that it fit the evidence better than anything else on offer. And follow-up expeditions have since shown that avalanches at that spot, which people swore were impossible, really do happen. There are quieter theories too, and honestly, they don't so much compete with the avalanche as sit next to it. One is just the wind itself, a katabatic windstorm, a sudden violent blast of cold air pouring down the slope, loud and disorienting and strong enough to feel like the mountain was coming apart. That by itself might be enough to make you abandon a tent you were sure was about to be flattened. Another one is stranger and more famous, from the writer Donnie Eichar. He suggested that the shape of Kholat Shakal could, in the right wind, spin up little vortices in the air, and with them, infrasound. That sound too low for you to actually hear, but strong enough to make the human body feel dread and nausea and panic. So on this theory, the hikers weren't running from something they could see. They were running from a wave of pure physical anxiety that the wind was generating, that made sitting in that tent unbearable. It's a haunting idea. It's also the weakest one, and it's fair to just say that. The exact geometry you'd need to produce that kind of infrasound is unreliable, and even if terror did empty the tent, panic still doesn't explain the crushed chests down in the ravine. At best, infrasound is a supporting player. The avalanche is the one that actually accounts for the bodies. Which brings us back to those details that make your skin crawl, because they deserve real answers, not just a spooky shrug. The missing eyes and tongue. Those 4 bodies lay for months in running water, in a snowmelt stream, before anybody found them. And soft tissue, eyes, lips, the tongue, is the first thing to go in conditions like that, to the water, to normal decomposition, to small scavengers. It's an awful thing to picture. It's also, forensically, completely ordinary. There's no evidence of any deliberate mutilation, and every sign of a body left too long in a cold creek. The radiation. It was only a couple of items of clothing, at modest levels. And one of the men who died, Krivonishenko, worked at a nuclear facility. The likeliest source is exactly that mundane: contamination on his clothes, which another hiker later put on. On top of that, camping lanterns back then used mildly radioactive mantles. It's a very thin thread to hang a secret weapons test on. And the orange skin and gray hair that people described at the funerals. Almost certainly exaggerated. Some mix of windburn after days on an exposed slope, the normal discoloration of decomposition, and the shaky memories of grieving relatives standing over an open casket. Even those strange lights in the sky that winter were most likely distant Soviet rocket or missile tests. Real enough, but many miles away, and not what killed anybody on that slope. Take each impossible detail on its own, one at a time, and it stops being impossible. It just becomes tragic. So, which was it in the end? The honest answer is that we'll probably never know for certain. Everyone who could actually tell us died on that mountain, and the one who lived only knew that he'd said goodbye to his friends and walked away. But the fog has thinned a lot, and the modern consensus, backed by physics, by modeling, by the injuries themselves, is that you don't need a monster or a soldier or a secret weapon to explain any of it. A weakened slab of snow, undercut by their own careful campsite and loaded up by the wind, let go in the dark. Hurt and terrified, doing a lot of the right things for the wrong disaster, 9 skilled young people made a chain of reasonable decisions that led them, one step at a time, into the cold. And I know, after the aliens and the Yetis and the sealed Soviet files, that can feel like a letdown. But sit with it, and it's actually heavier, because it means they weren't chosen or cursed or hunted by anything. They were just unlucky on a mountain that the people who lived there had already, a long time ago, decided to call dead. Igor Dyatlov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, Ludmila Dubinina, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Alexander Kolovatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, 9 names, on a pass that now carries their leaders, not victims of the unknown, just of the winter and the wind, and one bad slope on one very bad night. Thank you for sitting with me in quiet dark. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on your way out. See you next time.